Okay, so today I want to talk about sort of another way in which I differ from most people in politics in the way I think about and relate to and talk about politics. Because I do try to play a role that isn't already being played. That is important to me, to be playing a role in the political process that isn't already being covered better by somebody else. I think there are people, experts in abortion, for example. I think they're already doing a good job talking about abortion as an issue. I want to focus on things I'm passionate about, things I know about. And this might be an area where I differ. Much like my video on the different types of political engagement, where I talked about how I don't really engage very much with sort of standard national news. That's not really something that's a big priority for me personally. In this case, I'm going to talk about institutionalism, I guess is what I call it. There's a lot of different definitions of institutionalism in politics, but screw you guys. You don't get to own the word institutionalism. It just means to do something in a way that relates to institutions. That's so vague. You don't get to have the word institutionalism. This is my institutionalism, and it means whatever I say it means. Okay. Um, yeah, this is my institutionalism. The idea here is, instead of just talking about any one policy that a government could pass, any one issue that they could be, debating, deliberating, and focusing on, which is normally what people in politics talk about. They debate and deliberate policy. I'm going to be talking about how that policy gets determined. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about three things, all right? This is my terrible handwriting, by the way. This is my real, actual handwriting. Who? Who makes the decisions, okay? How? How do they make the decisions? What's their process of arriving at a decision, okay? And then jurisdiction. Jurisdiction or scope, I've said in some points. Which is basically, federalism, right? The states should decide. That's jurisdiction, right? That's leaving it up to the states. That's they're in charge of the states, whereas the federal government is in charge of the entire country. Okay? There's other ways to do jurisdiction. I'll get to that more when I get to that step, all right? So I'm going to start with who. And I've come up with a list of different who's that one might think should be making decisions, right? So one that I got here is workers, right? A lot of models of socialism are about having workers or like employees, right? Whether they're government employees or employees at a company, have them participate more significantly in decision making. Different socialists will disagree about what specifically they mean by that, how exactly they should be involved and participate. But generally speaking, integrating workers more meaningfully into the decision making process, that's a pretty big thing for a lot of socialists and leftists, right? And then there's consumers. Again, this is kind of secondary a lot of time to workers for leftists. I think that's mostly for historical reasons. I actually personally believe that in the 21st century, consumers are starting to be a bigger issue with capitalism and with the flaws of capitalism than anything relating to the employer-employee dynamic. But again, this is just who gets to decide, right? So one system I've seen described is a system in which workers and consumers kind of have their own different councils, and they sort of come together and make decisions about regional enterprise and this would be a socialist economy, right? So it would be publicly owned, but then the way that that publicly owned enterprise decides how production is going to function would be workers and consumers making decisions together as a group, right? And then there's the people. The people, this could probably be better labeled as citizens, might be another way to put this. This is voters, right? This is the ordinary Americans in our society. Those are the people in this context, right? So when we vote for a candidate, that is the people deciding. Um, I'll get to other ways the people can decide later, right? Then the users. So this is an interesting one. This is kind of similar to consumers, but this was a way of thinking proposed by a book called Recoding America by Jennifer Pahlka, that I strongly suggest to anyone. I might have her on as a guest at some point to talk about it. She's talking about government provisioning of services, and she wants to modernize it and view it in the same way that modern sort of tech people, especially programmers, view their workflow, their process when coming up with a new program. And so one of the ways she describes how to do that is to treat the people being provided a service by the government as a constituency. So this isn't consumers as an abstract sort of a group. This is specifically anybody who uses a government service, and they might not even be a consumer. Like, for example, a government website. When Obamacare came out, it had this just awful, awful website. And many authors in recent years have written sort of technocratic, centrist type books about why can't the government make a friggin' website? They should be able to do that. Yeah, regarding that subject specifically. So this is kind of an answer to that question. Why can't the government make a website? Because it's not getting enough feedback from the people using the website, and it's not incorporating that feedback quickly enough into the decision-making process. So this is another group of people who might make a decision, right? Then there's interest groups. So interest groups is often said with like a scary tone. And I think it kind of depends on the interest groups. Sometimes interest groups can be everything from unions, whether they're private sector unions or public sector unions, like teacher unions. Sometimes that's considered an interest group. Sometimes corporations are considered an interest group. Lobbyists, that's considered an interest group. But interest groups can also mean groups like the NRA to some degree, or the NAACP, or any sort of activist-y organization like that. NAACP might be a really good example of an interest group. It's a group of people who have banded together around a specific issue to advocate more effectively than they could as lone individuals in the government. They're coming together. In the NAACP's case, it's civil rights. It's a group of people coming together to support specifically black civil rights and to focus on black issues with the government, right? So they're interesting to talk about because there's a theory called associational democracy, which is contentious on both the right and the left. There's really no consensus on the role of associations, I don't feel, anywhere on the political spectrum. There's a great book edited by Erik, Olin, Wright on associations and democracy, where people on the left debate and deliberate the role of associations. Some of them think that associations should have a fairly minimal role because they're thinking of associations as largely being like corporations and lobbyists that sort of corrupt the government, and they're also thinking of associations as kind of elitist, right? You have leadership of these associations playing a stronger role rather than the ordinary member of these groups playing a stronger role. And then there's other people who are like, well, no, we need to have a sort of a banded together approach. We need to have collective groups for the protection of minorities. Like, that's useful for a pluralistic society, and they argue that a socialist society should also have a strong role for interest groups. So again, contentious pretty much anywhere. So I think that's an interesting issue, right? I think that all of these are interesting because all of these are deciding how our laws get made. Rather than just debating one another about any particular issue, I think we should re-examine how we come to our conclusions in the first place. The next one here, representatives, that's pretty obvious. That's the people we've elected. That's politicians, right? Obviously, in a representative democracy, representatives make decisions. In a direct democracy, ordinary people make more decisions. So that's why they're on the list, is to distinguish between those categories. And then this last one I think is interesting: experts, right? Experts can mean a bunch of different things. It's debatable to what extent formal credentials make someone an expert versus life experience or other things like that. Whew, I gotta breathe. Experts, there's an entire group in politics that advocates experts being in charge. They're called technocrats. They have a very weird history. They started out as socialists. These days, they're mostly kind of in the middle of the political spectrum. They're usually pretty pro-authority, like compared to like a libertarian who's very free market. There's a lot of technocratic people, and I've been noticing an emergence on both the right and the left lately of more pro-expertise sentiments, especially post Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, all of these sort of populist right-wing leaders. There's been a rising sentiment on the left and even more moderate, like never Trump Republicans on the right, that we need a return to normal. And along with that desire for a return to normal comes a desire for a return of expertise, a movement away from misinformation. There's an attempt to kind of be like, hey, I don't care if you're left or right, I don't care where you come from on the political spectrum. Let's just try to care about facts and credentials and experience and all of those sorts of things. And yeah, so that's the group of people these days who are probably most likely to advocate for a more expert-driven government. So that's everybody on the who. Now let's go to the how do they make decisions, right? And again, you can mix and match these. That's kind of why I did it this way, is because you can mix and match the relationships between these different things. So rotation, for example. Rotation is a strategy that has fairly minimal implications in mainstream politics. The closest thing to a debate in mainstream politics about rotating leadership is probably term limits, right? Technocrats, the people who like experts, tend to like longer terms. They tend to say like we should extend terms to 10 years rather than being like 4 years like the president typically is. The idea is that with a longer time horizon, then they can get more stuff done instead of just worrying about re-election and having to get re-elected. And the pro-rotation people, it tends to have to do at least a little bit with the psychology of power. I know anarchists tend to be, one proposal for an anarchist system is communes, like local communes where it's all on the level of a small community, and leadership would be rotated out from time to time such that everybody gets a taste of power. I've even heard rotation in Rojava, which is a country I think is very inspiring and interesting politically. They're a libertarian socialist, sort of an experiment in the Middle East, and they have an interesting police system, right? Because you've got to think they're basically anarchists. They're basically abolish the police, right? But their system is unique because what they did was not so much abolish the police as deprofessionalize the police. They have people walking around with like AK-47s because they're a war-torn region, and the people walking around with AK-47s enforcing the rules and norms of their communities are other community members. And for the most part, they rotate between them so that everybody has a role. That way you don't get a small handful of people who are the police for whom like power goes straight to their head and they see themselves as separate from the community. This idea is the police will be the community. The community is literally going to take turns playing this enforcer role and policing itself, right? So that's just another example of where rotation can come into play. Term limits, rotating leadership, and even rotating police forces, for example. Next is elections. That one's pretty obvious. You vote for something, and then somebody wins, right? That's our usual process of decision making for how we get our representatives is elections. I guess I probably should also note that elections don't have to be for representatives. You could vote, which is what the word election means here. It just means voting. Um, you could vote also on an issue, right? That's a referendum. That's what they did for Brexit in Britain. They had a referendum where everybody was allowed to vote directly on whether or not Britain should leave the European Union, and they voted to leave, and then they did. Um, then there's sortition. Sortition is often suggested as an alternative to representative democracy, where we take a random group of ordinary people and we put them in charge, right? It's a way of doing direct democracy. It's a way of having direct participation. One of the benefits of sortition is that it would probably be more demographically representative. It's hard to get women elected a lot of times, or at least that people say it's hard for them to get elected, and they're less represented in government than men are. And they're less represented in government than their proportion of the population. They're 50% of the population, but they're not 50% of our politicians. So that's one of the arguments people will tend to make for sortition, is that it would be demographically accurate, and it would be sort of non-elitist. It wouldn't be people who lie to get famous and then get elected. Like Donald Trump was a reality show host at one point, right? And that probably contributed to his well-knownness in the public, probably helped him get elected. With sortition, you get more normal people, just everyday people participating more directly. I personally think there's some interesting stuff we could do with sortition, even if it's not replacing our legislature, replacing our politicians, entirely. I do think there are some places we could kind of inject a little bit of sortition. We could use it in our bureaucracy. We could have some directly democratic panels hold our bureaucrats a little bit more accountable. And we could even use it for, this is another one I've heard suggested as an alternative, for the police, right? You could have community control of the police by choosing random citizens and having them serve on a board of accountability for the police department. Have them show up, random group of people, and just determine whether or not the police is doing a good job for their community. This next one, discernment. So discernment is a function of decision making we don't have to think about because it's so obvious. Monarchs just decide. They use discernment. Dictators, they just decide. They use discernment. But also, judges use discernment, right? When a judge makes a decision on a law, as they're acting as an individual, and they have a degree of power and a degree of authority vested in them, and they get to decide. That's in the case of a court of law, the answer to the question, how is a decision made, is a guy with a robe decides, right? Then there's vetoes. Okay, so vetoes is important because I'm very interested in sort of a realist approach to how the government works. If you look at legal scholars, like Ronald Dworkin is a famous legal scholar, he'll talk about the metaphors that undergird law, the stories, the traditions, and the principles. And it's all, to me, kind of nebulous. It's kind of vague. There's some value to it. I can see why there would be value to it, especially if you're a lawyer, being in touch with that cultural tradition, I guess. But for me, what really interests me is, at the end of the day, who gets to make the final call? Who gets to call the shots? Especially when it comes to law. And veto is oftentimes how they do that. Veto is obviously the biggest example is our president can veto a law, right? You probably learned that in your 10th grade civics class. But the entirety of our separation of powers, the entirety of our checks and balances, every part of our system relies on various groups and individuals having some amount of veto power over other institutions. And to me, just saying this is how it normally functions. This is how a government normally functions. This is the sort of social glue that makes a government function. Especially, again, I'm going to say post Donald Trump. There's a lot of people saying we had all these social norms in place of what a president is supposed to do, how a president is supposed to behave, and somebody came in and they broke those social norms, and they didn't behave the way you expect a president to behave. And after that, now we have to rethink how how much power do we want them to actually be able to have, right? In terms of the presidency. But you can do that with all kinds of institutions. Relying on people following the conventions of society is, I don't think, a smart long-term approach. I think you have to ask yourself, where does power lie? Who ultimately gets to call the shots? Who has veto power? And that's important when talking about the separation of powers. The next thing here, weighted voting. So I put this in its own separate category, weighted voting, because there's a couple of systems that I think are interesting to think about that I've read about recently that attempt to break the one person, one vote sort of rule in democracy. One is called quadratic voting. That's an interesting system. The goal of quadratic voting is to allow people to express preferences. So if you're really passionate about hunting because you're personally a hunter, and that issue is very, very important to you, and maybe you've regularly voted probably Republican because you feel like they're going to be the ones most ready to defend and protect your rights as a hunter, right? If that's your key issue, then maybe you don't want to just vote for a Republican. Maybe you don't want to vote on every issue. Maybe you want to focus more of your voting power on that one issue. So quadratic voting is a system that allows you to use what are called like vote credits. And you can choose not to participate, not to vote on various issues, and to save up your credits and to then spend them on an issue you're really passionate about. It's a way of trying to make sure you're able to express your preferences. And the reason it's called quadratic voting, I should note, is because in order to soften the ability to focus on one issue above all else, in order to soften that and encourage you to spread your votes at least a little bit across various issues, the authors who came up with this idea, Glen, Weyl, and Erik Posner, in the book Radical Markets, if you want to learn more about it, they suggested taking the square root of the number of credits. So, for example, you could save up 9 credits to cast 3 votes, or you could save up 4 credits to cast 2 votes, or 1 credit could cast 1 vote, if you get what I'm saying there. Right? So they're taking the square root of the number of credits you spend, and that's how many votes you end up with. And because they're taking the square root, and that's called a quadratic, it's quadratic voting. Next is deliberation. This is something I feel like doesn't get talked about a lot. This is an entire debate in the theory of democracy that almost never spills over into mainstream politics, and that's the role of actually talking to one another, actually debating and deliberating. There's an entire group of democratic theorists who say that a big part of the problem with our democracy is that we're literally just not debating one another, we're not talking to one another, we're not engaging in deliberation, and we're also not sitting on the issues long enough. We're having massive bills that we don't have time to read. Politicians, I guess I should say. Politicians are being sat with massive bills they don't have time to read. They get a vague impression of them. They come to a conclusion rapidly, and they vote, and then they move on. And there's not a lot of room for hearing the other side out. There's not a lot of room for learning other perspectives. There's not a lot of room for conversation, which I think is sad. I think it would be really great if politicians had to engage in a really depthful process of argumentation and really had to hear each other's voices more often. I think we live in a very alienated society. We're all on the internet, and I think coming together as human beings and hearing each other talk is valuable politically now more than ever. So supermajorities. This is another one. Supermajorities. I've actually written several essays about supermajorities because supermajorities. The simple way of explaining it is it's just you need a 2/3 vote instead of a 50% vote, right, or a 51%. So you need more support. So in many ways, it's a way of slowing down the process of decision making and garnering broad support, right? Rather than passing laws that only have support from exactly 51% of the population, the idea behind a supermajority is that we're only going to pass laws that are really, really popular, that are like most people can get behind this. Supermajorities are also used for things like changing the Constitution. And I also think there's a relationship between supermajorities and there's an anarchist concept of consensus. In consensus, the goal is to have every single person literally agree. Because a lot of times they have voluntary organizations where everybody just comes together and voluntarily associates. So they have splitting and consensus. So if you're not interested in being a part of a specific action that an anarchist group is doing, you can split off and have your own group. You don't have to participate. Everybody who does participate, though, is in agreement that that's what they're doing. That's they're in, you know. Supermajorities, I think, in some ways, there's the same kind of a debate about the role of supermajorities as there is about consensus and vice versa, because on one hand, they could be bureaucratic, they can be slow, they can slow down the decision-making process. When you think of it in relationship to consensus, the obvious criticism of consensus is, I'm blurry, there we go. The obvious criticism of consensus is what if even one person disagrees, and now we can't get anything done because one person disagreed. Is that really worthwhile to slow down the decision-making process that much that we need to heed the will of this one stubborn individual? Supermajorities has a sort of the same problem, but to a lesser degree. Obviously, the bigger a supermajority, the more a problem sticklers can be. If you need 80%, then it's basically impossible to get what you need to get done. So supermajorities can be a useful tool if you're trying to thoughtfully slow down the process of legislation. You're trying to make sure there's a broader consensus and broader agreement before a policy gets passed. But it can also be dangerous in that it reduces the capacity of our government and creates deadlock, I guess you could say. Randomness. Yeah, so this is that's very rarely a part of government, but hypothetically you could literally just decide things at random, and I do think that there are some theories that where maybe a degree of randomness could be useful. Here's one area where randomness I think was advocated in a book called, I think it was Science and Expertise is the name of the book, Science and Expertise. The author argues that sort of establishment scientists in government sort of focus funding for scientific research onto their own pet interests, and they don't pay attention much to new or out there ideas, and there's sort of an elitism to science, right? And she's a socialist, and she's a populist socialist, and she argues for a more populist approach to scientific funding. And one of the ways she said that the government could fund more diverse scientific research is just create literally a lottery. Just have people create their research proposals, and some of them are determined by expertise, some of them are thoughtfully, we choose where to fund science and where not to fund science. But some of them could just be chosen completely at random through a lottery system. I don't even know what that says. Legislative agenda over time. So I know what legislative agenda setting is. Legislative agenda setting is the process by which we determine what laws we're going to be voting on. And that is another subject that doesn't get talked about very much. Congress chooses to take up a certain number of laws every session. Um, they obviously don't infinitely pass laws. You know what I mean? Of course, they have to sort of choose how many laws they feel they can handle any given session. And so there's a process of determining what laws are priority and what laws are not priority. And I think that's why it's over time. I made this chart a long time ago. I think that's why it's over time, is because it's related to the amount of time it takes to pass a given law. So legislative priorities on one hand, expediency on the other. Finally, we're in jurisdiction. So the big one for jurisdiction is federalism. As I said earlier, that's who decides, the state government or the federal government. That can also be who decides, the state government or the local government. It can be really any sort of devolution that is geographical in nature, I suppose. Then there's agency independence. So this is a key issue in the executive branch. This has become more of an issue than I ever expected it to be recently, because we just lost Chevron deference in the Supreme Court. And Chevron deference is an issue where the legislative branch, Congress, the politicians, the people who make laws, they were deferring, hence deference, to the bureaucratic agencies, also known as the administrative state. We're talking about all the three-letter agencies: the FDA, the EPA, the people with the dynamite and the guns and the alcohol, whatever that one is, tobacco and firearms, TFA. There we go, tobacco and firearms, TFA. All of those groups of people are members of the bureaucracy, and they're usually expert-driven groups of people that pass specific regulations. And there's so much regulation that gets passed that it's hotly debated how much we should rely on these unelected individuals to make those regulations, because they're kind of unaccountable, but we also kind of depend on them making these decisions, because otherwise our legislators, our politicians, would have to pass laws for every single intimate detail, every single regulation, every single drug that gets approved by the FDA would have to be seen as approved or not approved by legislators. So Chevron deference, that's a big issue where agency independence has become debated in the Supreme Court recently. And the other big issue is Project 2025. Donald Trump and a variety of conservative agencies plan for, if Trump gets reelected, how they're going to try and employ as many Republicans as possible into the executive branch. Whether you're for or against this idea, it's definitely an idea that is closely related to how should the executive branch behave, how should they function. In this case, centralizing more decision making in the hands of the president, as well as creating a highly politicized bureaucracy that is capable of making very autonomous decisions for itself. Agency scope. So this is, again, kind of similar. I heard a debate at one point about the scope of the FDA, what sorts of issues they should cover and they should not cover. It's just about how much sort of authority, how wide the authority of a given agency goes. This becomes an issue when we're talking about overlapping agencies. Technocrats will sometimes argue condensing a bunch of these different three-letter agencies into bigger agencies. So I think there was like Department of Transportation and Aviation, for example. Those are two separate departments right now, I believe. Don't cite me on that. And I think one of the proposals was to condense them into one agency for efficiency's sake. Whereas I guess the opposite version of that would be to split off these agencies into as many hyper specific niches as possible so they can focus more closely on the stuff that the experts in that agency are very directly familiar with. And then autonomy of business, civil society, and trusts. So I'll get to trusts in a moment. So this issue is also very important to me because I was looking into how to decentralize a variation of socialism, right? And I wanted to see how could you devolve decision making as low as possible while still retaining the goal of moving away from a system of maximizing profits and towards a system of conscious, rational decision making about what is best for society at large, what is best for the stakeholders involved. And one idea that I came across was, publicly owned, democratically governed enterprises, individual enterprises. So obviously, those sorts of enterprises, giving autonomy to them, it's a little bit different from decentralizing, quote unquote decentralizing, in the sense of devolving down to state governments or local governments. That's a little bit different from devolving from a regional government to an institution like a business, like a public bank or the postal service, for example. That's a little bit of a different kind of decentralization, and so I felt it should have its own category. It's also relevant for things like public-private partnerships. Any kind of a debate over industrial policy, which is where the government funds private businesses in the hopes of getting private businesses to pursue certain specific goals, or public-private partnerships, which is, I think, basically the same thing I just said. It's partnerships between the public sector and the private sector. I guess public-private partnerships are kind of just a form of industrial policy. Both of those are ways in which the government is relating to business and also civil society. That's the other thing. This is another group that doesn't get discussed a lot, but there's a lot of charities. There's a lot of well organized community groups that aren't local governments, that aren't just geographically organized across the entire community, which could play a role. Sometimes you hear maybe we should depend more upon charities for service delivery, for programs for the poor, like homeless people, for example. That's a debate, the role of civil society in that kind of service delivery. And then I also included trusts in here because trusts are a unique form of, it's not a business, it's not a charity, really. It's a legal entity that is designed to sort of make and it's hard to describe. Well, let's say you're sending your children to college, right? You can create a trust fund, you can create a trust for them that can only be opened by them and only for the purposes of college. So it's a sort of a legal entity that protects that money and sets it aside. It's not a business on the market in the formal sense because there's a legal wall built around it that prevents that money from going elsewhere. It's not just college funds though. It's also conservation trusts, right? Where the land is placed in a trust to be preserved for future generations. That's not quite the same as a business. Conservation trust might run a business, but it's not legally allowed to be sold. So there's a legal wall built between it and the broader marketplace. And there's an entire group of people called commoners who, I think, from what I understand of them, their entire worldview operates through trusts, through exposing this other sector. They are the first thing to come up if you Google neither state nor market, That's how I know about them. And that's what they are. They're not the government, and they're not businesses. They're not the market. And I think that makes them an attractive alternative in a world where both the government and private businesses seem like they suck pretty hard. And as I said before, any of these can be mixed and matched, and this is my approach, right? Is I want to talk about policy when I want to. I'll talk about policy whenever I want to, and I'll talk about institutions whenever I want. This is my channel. You don't own me. But the real important thing I want to get across is that there's a division here between the two, between thinking institutionally, thinking about how we make decisions, and thinking about what specific decisions we make, and that there needs to be a new priority, a new wave of institutional thinking. There needs to be a lot of creativity. There needs to be more people thinking about what's going wrong with how decisions are getting made, because this is the root. These are the roots from which all of the other bad fruits grow. And that is all.